Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar, Therapeutic Interventions for Cognitive Dysfunction in Parkinson's. My name is Donna Greening, and I'm a Programs and Services Coordinator at Parkinson Canada. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. We are grateful for the expert speaker who is joining us today to share her knowledge during the webinar. If you have questions about today's topic after the conclusion of the webinar, please contact your healthcare provider or Parkinson Canada's Information and Referral Team. To access closed captioning, click on the CC Captions button and then click on Show Subtitle. If you'd like to submit a question for our presenter, be sure to write it in the Q&A window. The chat window is there for you to say hello and talk amongst yourselves. As with all our webinars, the resources and links mentioned today will be shared with you in an email, so there's absolutely no need to take any notes. And now, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Gail Eskes, who is a clinical neuropsychologist and professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dr. Eskes received her PhD in psychology from the University of California at Berkeley and completed postdoctoral research and clinical training in Halifax, as well as at the Rotman Research Institute in Toronto, Ontario. Dr. Eskes runs the Cognitive Health and Recovery Research Laboratory, and her research draws upon cognitive neuroscience, clinical neuropsychology, and rehabilitation science to develop approaches to understand, characterize, and treat cognitive issues due to brain aging and malfunction. Her research has been supported by over $10 million in competitive funding, resulting in over 100 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters. She is also a passionate clinical and community educator and runs clinical workshops and memory boot camps to promote a better understanding of how to optimize cognitive function in daily activities. Welcome, Dr. Eskes.
Thanks, Donna. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Well, I just want to thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to come here and talk to you all about cognition, a very favorite topic of mine, and how it is affected by Parkinson's disease. So to start, I just want to do some disclosures in terms of grant funding. So I've been funded by a variety of different organizations, including the Parkinson's Society, as well as I have an advisory consultant role with the Heart and Stroke Foundation in terms of cognitive impairment. And you should also know that I do have a patent application in for a method for cognitive enhancement, but I'm not really making any, I don't have any business arrangements around that, and the types of recommendations I'm making today are not clinically based. So for the roadmap today, first I'm just going to give you a brief little guide, a user's guide to the brain, to set you some context, and then talk about how changes in the brain and cognition occur in Parkinson's disease. Then we'll go into the interventions for these cognitive challenges, and then I'll end with some brain health information as well. So to start with, we're going to be talking about a little 3-pound computer that we all have sitting in our head. And it's really, when you start to get to know it, it's really quite a complex and amazing thing that it works on any of us at all, with an average number of neurons in the brain over 100 billion, and certainly more cells than stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's pretty awesome. And when you look inside the brain using something like an imaging, like multiple magnetic resonance imaging, you can see the different constituents in the brain that do the work. And this is a cross section of the brain, and you can see the little gray areas that line the brain are the brain cells. And look at all of that white area, that's the connections of the brain cells. And then the black area are the fluid, is the fluid that nourishes the brain and helps take away the wastes. And it's the brain cells and the connections that we're going to be talking about today. Now, the incredible thing is that it's these connections, and you can see how big a landscape there was with the connections. That gives us the computing power. And the network of connections is even more vast than the number of cells, of course. And here's a couple of pictures of how the cells connect together, and all those little white things on this one cell are all the connections it's making. And it's been estimated that if you were trying to count them, that counting them at the rate of 1 per second would take you over 32 million years. So it's pretty neat that we have this brain power in our head, and how we have all of the cells talking to each other. And they send signals and talk to each other with the neurotransmitters. And so these are the networks that underlie what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the cognition and your abilities. So different parts of your brain do different things. And you can see here the location of some of the networks that are related to cognition. Executive function in the front, walking on the top there, communication in the middle, memory down by the little thumb of the brain, and seeing in the back of the brain. And these networks are all affected differentially as the disease progresses. So how Parkinson's affects these different networks is what changes the cognitive abilities that you may be experiencing. Now, in Parkinson's disease, the hallmark is the loss of neurons in the substantia nigra, and that's that tiny little circle down at the base of the brain, as well as buildup of proteins in neurons throughout the brain that interfere with that chemical release, or those neurotransmitters that are needed for all those different networks. Importantly, the substantia nigra talks to the basal ganglia, or the striatum, that I've put the arrow towards. And it uses a chemical called dopamine, which is also a neurotransmitter. And so when those cells die in that little area at the base of the brain, then the dopamine levels in the striatum decline and interferes with the way it does its work. And that basal ganglia, or striatum area, is a way station for many different systems and networks, including your motor function, and thus you have your motor changes, and also cognition. And here is an illustration of areas that are affected by changes in dopamine in early Parkinson's disease. And so the effects are fairly widespread. You can see the blue areas, which are in the frontal cortex. And this frontal striatal network is one of the main areas that is affected first. And then the changes grow to other areas as the disease continues. And then you get changes in other chemical systems, that including the noradrenergic system, the serotonin, and the cholinergic system. And it's the combination of the changes in these cells with these chemicals that lead to the spectrum of deficits that we're going to go into. And so I wanted to just first of all talk about how do these brain changes impact cognition in terms of the natural history and what happens, and then we'll get into what are the cognitive changes. So this graph shows the spectrum of cognitive changes that might be seen at the time of diagnosis. So let me just orient you here. The white line, vertical line, is when you might have had a diagnosis. And so there might be some buildup to the diagnosis. And you can see along the top, as it goes up, the different forms of cognitive impairment, and I'll explain those in a minute. And then time is what happens as the disease continues. And so first, you might have, a lot of people might just have normal cognition. There will be no change in cognitive abilities before the diagnosis happens. Some people might have what's called subjective cognitive decline, which is noticed by the person or their family or their healthcare workers. But performance, when you were to actually do standardized testing, performance on those tests would be what we would call in the normal range. That is no different than colleagues that are the same age and background as you. So this particular spectrum, the subjective cognitive decline, is pretty hard to diagnose right now. But it might be a harbinger of future decline, but not necessarily. Some people never get any worse than that. Then you might have what's called mild cognitive impairment, where you can see changes in performance now on those standardized tests, but not very much. And the problems really don't add up to anything in terms of affecting your day-to-day independence or your daily function. So you see MCI, as we call it, in about 10 to 20 and perhaps up to 50% of people who are when they're given a diagnosis. And that partially depends on how it's defined and how easy it was to make a diagnosis, because we all know that Parkinson sometimes can be difficult to diagnose. Then you might have MCI that progresses or that might be worse, and that would go into dementia. And dementia is really multiple problems, more significant, that are interfering with your daily life. Now, this different spectrum really varies over time. So as you can see, with normal cognition, you may never get any change over time, and that's the purple and the gray areas. Those with subjective cognitive impairment might also not change very much, but you can see also that people with MCI may have some fluctuations where it gets a little worse, and then it gets better, then it gets worse, and then as it would gradually move into dementia as time goes on. So how frequent are these changes? This is what I've listed here is a number of different studies of of large groups of people at baseline and then followed through to see what kind of cognitive issues they have. And the different columns are, the N is how many were measured, and then CI means cognitive impairment was identified. MCI means that mild cognitive impairment was identified, and dementia was identified. And not to worry about the details, but I've just highlighted some of the range of prevalence at these different time periods. So at baseline, different studies have reported a range between 8% to 43%. But the most common is around 20%. But then as time goes on, the prevalence gets a little, it grows with time to about 20% in 5 or 6 years. And then by the time it's been 20 years, then a significant number have dementia. So it does grow in terms of the prevalence over time, but this doesn't really mean anything for one particular person, because while 80% might have shown dementia in 20 years, that means that 20% did not. So just keep that in mind. So what cognitive abilities are we really talking about here? And so what I've got here is a pyramid to show you a different range of cognitive abilities. And we'll be talking about 3 of them here that I've put the arrows by: attention, memory, and EF, which is executive function. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that no ability works alone, and that the flow of information goes from the bottom to the top, and also from the top to the bottom. And you can see things like processing speed, which I put at the bottom because it underlies everything that we think or do. It's one of the basics of how the brain works. And you could imagine how with a slower processing speed, which can be fairly common in Parkinson's, it underlies all abilities. So it could impact sensory motor, attention, communication, memory, all of these other abilities. So it makes it sometimes a little difficult to tease apart what exactly is going on. As well, executive function I put at the top, but it also works from the top down. So it helps to regulate how you use your knowledge and perception, how you use your memory, your communication. It helps regulate attention and your sensory motor system. So really, It's a very interactive system where all the networks are constantly talking to each other. And those, as I said, teasing up what issues are a problem is a complex task. And the kind of thing that really needs to be done in a standardized assessment by a health professional. And so you need to keep this complexity in mind whenever you're trying to figure out, what's bothering me. And understanding these issues can then help you think about, well, what is it that I want to do to get better? So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by attention and executive function. So in terms of attention, there are actually 3 different attention networks that govern all of our different processing areas. They're independent, but they usually work together. So the first network is something called vigilance, or helps you achieve and maintain responsiveness in a task. So if you have something that you have to maintain and do for a long period of time, such as driving a car down a very quiet road at night, this is when you need your vigilance to maintain that ability to respond to something that might unexpectedly happen. And with problems with the vigilance, then you lose that focus and you can't maintain what it is that you need to continue doing. Selective attention is about finding and responding to the right information depending on what it is you're trying to do at the moment. Finding your glasses when you're trying to read something, finding your keys when you're trying to go to the store. And with problems with selective attention, you often feel like you have no focus, that you can't filter out unwanted noise, and you get overwhelmed easily. Say, for instance, at the grocery store or at the shopping mall, and that if there's too much noise and too much going on, it's just hard to pay attention to anything at all. The third system is what we call the executive control system, which helps you regulate all your tasks and any conflicts. This system is needed because all of the other systems can't all work at once. And so you need something like a conductor to help you decide what's the most important goal, what am I going to do first, how am I going to switch to something else, and how do I maintain the right focus in what I'm going to do. When you have problems with executive control, then sometimes it's hard to get started. Sometimes it's hard to switch to something else, and you perseverate on tasks. Sometimes it's hard to stop. You may have trouble with working memory or your mental scratch pad, which you use when you're trying to do something in your head. And you definitely would have trouble doing 2 things at once. Now, I talk about these things as if they're all clinical problems, but you know what? We all have issues with these types of things at one time or another. So the first thing I wanted to do then is to give you a little example of what I mean by paying attention. And so I'm going to show a little video, and you can just follow along and you can try to do the task if you wish, and then you'll get the answer at the end. And then we can talk about it. So here we go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
Okay, so if you feel comfortable, you could put how many passes you saw by the white team, frankly, I never see that 13th pass. So I'm having trouble following the white team. And I think, you know, for those who have trouble with speed of processing, this would be a very challenging task. But if you sort of think about what you're doing when you're doing this task, first of all, you have to maintain your focus and you can't let distractions interfere with you. You have to keep things in mind using your working memory in order to keep track of the number of passes. And that filtering of trying to focus only on the white and remembering to not pay attention to the black is what is going to potentially mean that you don't see the moonwalking bear. So this is a good example of how we use all of our attentional abilities at once. And you can really see how effortful it might be under conditions where things are moving really quickly. And you can also see how you might miss things if you're doing something but not and focusing really hard on it, and other things are happening. So what do I mean by executive function 2 or frontal lobe function? So this is now related to that the striatal frontal circuits that are affected by that loss of dopamine from the substantia nigra. And not to worry about all of this information, but really what we're talking about here are 4 different ways that the front of our brain helps us regulate our behavior. The first way is what we've been talking about in terms of switching, stopping yourself, adjusting or monitoring, am I doing it right? And if you have problems with that, then you may feel that you're too distractible, that someday things are harder than others. And sometimes it's hard to learn things and you have trouble with perseveration or not being able to stop doing a task and switch to another one. It's also important for what we call behavioral and emotional regulation. And what that's about is emotional lability. And if you have problems with that, you might have trouble with swings in mood. You might have trouble understanding how things, what's important. Things may feel different now. You may not feel like there's anything that's important right now. And it also helps you sort of direct your behavior and learn from rewards. And if this works, then I'm going to do it again. There's energization, which is really giving you the drive and the motivation to try anything. And problems with that leads to the apathy, which can be a problem with Parkinson as well. And then there's the metacognitive, or sort of awareness of what others are thinking or feeling. And sometimes that makes it difficulty understanding what someone else is thinking or feeling and having some empathy. So now I'm just going to give you a little example of what we mean by this executive control. So again, you can you can try along with me. This is really just an example of what happens when you have 2 different things that you're trying to do and one of them gets in the way of the other. So the first thing I want you to try to yourself, and you can just say it to yourself or you can say it out loud, just read those words out loud to me. So you would say red, green, yellow, blue, green, yellow, red. And this is something that's called the Stroop task. And in an assessment, we would actually measure how long it takes you to read those words. But word reading is pretty automatic. And it's something that doesn't feel like is very novel and seems pretty straightforward most of the time. Then we would ask you to name the patches of color. So you would say red, yellow, blue, red, yellow, green, blue. And that's actually not quite as automatic as reading the words, because we don't go around in our life naming colors unless you're a designer or you're someone who uses colors, you're a painter. So those tend to be a little more effortful, but still it seems pretty automatic. Now, in the next line, I'm going to put up words again in different colors. And this time, For the patches, you were just naming the color. And now I want you to name the color of the word. So for this one, you would say that first word is yellow, that second word is in green, the third word is in blue, and so on. Red, blue, yellow, red. Okay, we're good to go still. And in fact, this may have felt a little easier because you've got the word helping you identify the color, and it's the same. Now we have a different task. It's the same idea. I want you to name the color of the word. So ignore the word itself, but just name the color. Now I'm just going to let you try this for a couple of seconds, and then I'll give it a go. So what you should say is green, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, blue. But oh my goodness, that feels so much more effortful. And then if you try it again, as you continue, it seems to get worse and worse. It's like it sort of builds up that interference of the word, of reading the word with the naming of the color. So in this case, you would say yellow, blue, yellow, green, blue, red, green. And I'm going really slow so I don't make any mistakes. But if you're really trying to read it at normal rate, you might find that you're having trouble distinguishing between reading the word and naming the color. So this is an example of a conflict. We have an automatic thing that we want to do, name the color, name the word, read the word, but what we're supposed to do is name the color. And we have to use our executive system to help inhibit that automatic response so that we can do the other one. Okay, I also mentioned memory is a problem in Parkinson's, and we actually have a few different memory systems as well. So the first system would be seen if I were to ask you, what did you have for dinner yesterday? Or where did you go to high school? Or when is your appointment with the doctor? And that's what's called the episodic system. And it's about your life episodes. It's sort of like your daily mental diary. And it's for remembering things in the past and doing things right now. And it's also for thinking about things in the future. It actually sort of lets you time travel, going backwards and forwards. Now, there's another system that you would use if I were to ask you things like, what is the capital of Saskatchewan? How much is 3 times 2? What is the meaning of the word capital? And that's your semantic system. That's your storehouse of facts and words, your knowledge. It's a bit like your mental encyclopedia. And you use that when you're retrieving words and facts. Now, the third system is a system that you would use when you ride a bike, or you play the piano, or you type on a keyboard. And if I were to say, where is the B on a keyboard, you might have to think about where you'd move your finger to know where that letter is. And that's what's called your procedural system. And it's the one where you store all your habits and your automatic action memories. And honestly, a lot of our behavior is related to automatic habits and this system. And that's a good thing because it lets us do more than one thing at a time. So for instance, if you're walking down the street, you have to, when you're driving in a car, there are many things that you have to do. And when you're just learning, of course, it's very effortful because you have to think about doing all of them at the same time. But once you've practiced a lot of driving, then some of the things become more automatic, so you can pay attention to the unexpected things that you need to look out for, like someone running into the road, or, oh, the lights just turned red. So now one thing I want to get into before we talk about the interventions is the idea that there is you have all these cognitive abilities, but your function actually depends upon a number of factors other than your ability. So in addition to the strengths and weaknesses that you have in terms of your abilities per se, the factors that might influence your ability to use your cognition would be things like other psychological factors, such as depression, anxiety, apathy. So while these don't necessarily affect the networks for your cognitive ability, it does make it harder to use them. The same with physical health factors, getting a poor night's sleep, fatigue, which is very common in Parkinson's, illness or pain. These all things are also going to interfere with you using your cognition to the best that you can. And then finally, environmental factors, where you live, how noisy it is, what kind of structure is in your environment, how many caregivers, are around to help. Those things also can play a big role in how well you can use your abilities. So one thing to think about is optimizing these other factors can be a good first step or an additional step in trying to improve your thinking. So now let's talk a little bit about some cognitive interventions that we know about. So in terms of direct approaches, you can divide them into two different categories. One is training and practice, that's to restore the skill, like to restore the attention skill. And the other is learning strategies that help you compensate for problems with attention. Now, I should note that there are no yet recommended treatments, standard treatments for cognitive impairment like this, suggested by the Parkinson's Canada guidelines that was published in 2019. So what I'm going to be talking about is really still in the experimental research stage, but it's also based on the most recent meta-analyses or analysis of the latest studies. And it's also supplemented by quite a lot more research that has been done, at least in other groups, that we think we can apply to someone with Parkinson's, such as those with healthy aging, other dementia groups, or those with acquired brain injury. So the first category, the restoring the skill, is really about retraining specific skills. And retraining is often centered on those attention and executive function skills. And it includes intensive programs that aim to improve the skill by reinforcing the network through practice. So this approach is based on those principles of neuroplasticity, which involves the rewiring of connections due to the continued reusing of those networks over and over again. And cells that fire together, wire together. And so as you use them again and again, they're going to create a new network or reinforce the old network. The key about these programs of training are that they require a lot of intensive practice, and they often are adaptive. So they start out easy, and then as you get better at them, they get harder to keep you in the zone, to keep you challenged. They could have single or multiple cognitive domains that are being challenged, and they often give you feedback to keep you motivated and to help you with the relearning. They're mostly computerized, but there are some paper and pencil things out there as well. And in general, it's probably better to do this with a therapist or with someone who knows what the goals are and to help out with keeping you on task and helping you find the right one to do. But overall, the evidence for how effective these are is a bit mixed. But what was really fun to see is the latest analysis of the research that was published in 2022, so pretty recently, looking at how well does computerized cognitive training influence cognitive function in Parkinson's disease. So they looked at 17 randomized controlled trials of computerized cognitive training, and they pooled them all together to analyze them. And that's what you often do to try to figure out what's the big picture. And of good note, they found good evidence for benefit on clinical measures of global cognition across the 10 trials that used that measure, which involved more than 300 participants. And the benefit was about in the small to moderate range, especially in those who already had a bit of mild cognitive impairment. But it's also, they saw benefit in individual cognitive domains as well as global cognition. The key here is they realize you need a good dose of it. So these are studies that gave training for up to 12 weeks, 3 sessions a week for 30 to 60 minutes. And they found that multi-domain training, that is involving more than one cognitive domain, was important and more likely to be efficacious. But the effects wane over time without booster sessions. And they found no difference in remote training or on the computer versus in-person training. So that's also a good thing. And just to show you the types of programs that were used in these studies, here's an example of a program called the CORE Cognitive Training Program. And on the top panel, here is an instance of practice in unscrambling the sentence. So you're given a lot of words and your job is to figure out what the sentence is. Or on the right, you're given lots of pictures and your job is to figure out what's the order of the pictures. So this is trying to get at sequencing and working memory. Down below, you see a list of words and your job is to figure out the intruder or what doesn't belong in this list in the words, and on the right is what doesn't belong in the picture. So this is trying to help you work on your semantics, your understanding of material, and your ability to do a bit of reasoning. And I just wanted to show you as well, this is something that we've been using in our studies for what we call working memory training, or this is the ability to hold things in mind so that you can do work with them. And here is one where we were looking at your visual ability, your memory, your ability to hold things in your visual working memory or your visual scratch pad. And so the idea is to look for matches in that window as they come up. And you'll see, you can try to do it alongside with the person doing it. And there's a pattern there. Now, you're looking for the match. Is that a match? No, so you don't respond. Is that a match? Oh, that person responded, but it wasn't a match. Now that's a match with the last one. Is that a match? Yes. Is that a match to the last? Nope. How about that one? Yes. So with this one, what you're doing is you're looking at the pattern, you're trying to hold it in mind and then compare it to the next sequence of the next visual sequence. And here is one that gets a little harder. So this is adaptive. Here's one that gets a little harder because now you're both trying to remember the pattern, the visual pattern, as well as the letter that is said at the same time. So you're trying to see if there's a visual match or if there's an audio match or both. So go back to that. So you can try it along with it. Then you'll hear a letter as well.
K. K.
So that was visual and auditory match.
S.
Nope.
K.
Oh, same pattern, but not the same word.
Q.
The same letter. Not the same.
Q.
The same letter, not the pattern.
Q.
Both. So you can imagine how that would give you lots of experience and practice at trying to hold things in mind. Might also give you experience in processing speed and trying to keep up. And you also have to, respond to these things. So maybe a bit of motor training as well. I'm not going to skip that one in the interest of time. The other group that we talked about was compensation for the problems. And that involves learning strategies that compensate for some of the issues. And these can be often you learn them with individual or group-based, and it's focused on improving the function rather than the specific cognitive domain. And there are memory strategies available. There's executive strategies available called goal management training. And let me just give you some examples here. So for attention, strategies that you can use, and you would be teaching these and learning about these and practicing these in a group, of pacing yourself and taking breaks when you need them, or finding a structure in your day according to your energy level so that you do your hard tasks when you have your best attention at the best time of day. You're not as fatigued. For executive function, strategies would be to make sure you're avoiding multitasking and distraction in your environment when you're trying to do something. Developing some routines that help keep you on track. And then breaking down tasks into smaller units to make them more manageable, and learning a plan, do, check sequence where you plan what you're going to do, then you try it out, and then you keep an eye on and monitor how you're doing to see if it works. For memory, you might learn strategies that we would call the 3 R's. So repeating it. So when you want to remember something, practice retrieving it over and over again at longer and longer intervals. That gives you retrieval practice. Recording it, of course, keeping a written record of things that you need to remember and learning to use it systematically in terms of writing it on your calendar, making phone numbers and keeping track of names. And then also setting up routines, again, to set up a habit that cues you to remember things. So checking your calendar every morning, if you're writing on your calendar what your appointments are, putting your pill case where you'll see it when you have breakfast, and always leaving your keys in the same container. Now, these are all strategies that seem to make common sense, but the key is really developing them and using them. And that actually takes practice to develop these different habits and strategies to make them useful in your daily life. And the final thing I wanted to talk about was brain health approaches. And while none of these cognitive interventions have been proven to reduce the risk of progression of PD, these lifestyle modifications and approaches have been actually encouraged by the guidelines by the Parkinson Society. And these approaches are things like optimizing your physical health, getting physical activity, social activity, cognitive activity, and emotional health. And these are based on studies such as the Lancet Commission that looked at different factors that contribute to the occurrence of dementia. And they looked at it over the lifetime. And what they have here in this graphic is to show the impact of different factors that if they were to be improved or avoided, then that would help with the risk for dementia later. So things like hypertension, alcohol, reducing alcohol, avoiding obesity in midlife, things like giving up smoking, treating depression, avoiding social isolation and physical inactivity in later life, treating diabetes. These are all modifiable risk factors for dementia that would actually provide you with some protection for the progression of your cognitive issues. And so for physically, you want to manage your physical health with your doctor, quit smoking if you are, work on your blood pressure, alcohol, diabetes, obesity, and of course there's other physical health issues associated with Parkinson as well. Physical activity, move as much as you can. I know the guidelines from the sports people seem to be out of this world. but the best activity is the one that you can and will do as much as you can. Treadmill training has been looked at, dancing has been looked at, boxing has been looked at, and getting involved in one of these has many benefits, both to your physical health as well as your emotional health. And, if you do a group physical activity, then your social health, as well as having impact on memory and cognitive function, especially if it's aerobic and gets you breathing hard. Social isolation is really common, and it is a risk factor for problems in both physical, emotional, and cognitive health. So finding ways to share things, find activities you can share, joining a support group would be another strategy you could use for brain health. And while the specific cognitive training interventions haven't been yet proven through research studies, we do know that lifelong learning and being cognitively engaged can also reduce the risk of dementia. And the key here is a diversity of new mental activities. So, doing the New York Times crosswords is great, but if that's all you do and you do it for a long time, it gets to be pretty automatic. And what you want to do is switch to something else. Try drawing, try music, learning new board games, volunteering for something. So it really needs to be active engagement and new learning to get the benefits. Now, depression is also common, so keeping track and working on your emotional health is also important. And here are the signs of depression, which are sometimes very difficult to spot in Parkinson's, because depression also involves physical changes that overlap with Parkinson's symptoms, such as insomnia, fatigue, and loss of appetite. But those cognitive thoughts of hopelessness, pessimism, worthlessness, or feelings of sadness and being blue, if they persist over a long period of time or get worse, it'd probably be a good time to talk to your healthcare provider. Now, I've been talking about a lot of different things that you could do, particularly in the brain health. How do you get started? All these different factors. And there is an interesting website called the Fountain of Health, which helps you think about these different factors and helps you break down goals. And it gives you some support for working out an approach to help your brain health if you're interested in trying it. And it's just www.fountainofhealth.ca. So to wrap up, I've been talking about how cognitive changes are common in Parkinson and commonly affect attention, memory, and executive control. But cognitive function also depends on motivation, emotion, physical health, and the context. So keep those in mind as well. The evidence for interventions for cognitive problems is still growing, but more research is needed. And brain health approaches do have some support and recommendations from Parkinson Canada. So I'm going to stop there, and I know Donna has lots of questions, and hopefully there'll be some questions from you folks in the audience.
Great, thank you. If you could just stop sharing your screen. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eskes. What a fantastic explanation of cognition and what we can do to maintain or restore some skills. The demonstrations were fun and challenging to follow along with too. And for the record, I totally missed seeing the moonwalking bear.
Okay. So, I don't see it either, and I know it's there.
Yeah, you can only pay attention to so much, right? Well, it's now time to take some questions from our audience. And remember, if you have a question, please drop it into the Q&A tab. We had a lot of questions submitted with registration, so I've tried to group them together a bit so we can cover as many as possible. So I know you shared that, that chart showing the amount of dysfunction or cognitive dysfunction, but it was asked, what is the prevalence of cognitive dysfunction for people with Parkinson's?
Yeah, well, it sort of depends on the time frame, right, from between diagnosis and what you're talking about. But so the estimate is about 20% at the time of diagnosis, although some people can't even experience it before the diagnosis. But the estimate is about 20% initially, and then with growing, over time, then that growing to 30% and up to 80% with a longer term progression after that.
Mhm.
But just remember that these are percentages, and everybody is different, and that's why we're talking about brain health, right?
Right.
Is to see if there's something that we can do to slow that down.
Mhm. Right. Thank you. So there were several questions all about recognizing and monitoring symptoms. One person is going to be 70 soon, and they think they might be experiencing cognitive deficits. How can they know for sure? And if they
Yeah.
are, how do they know if they're caused by normal aging or by medication, sleep deprivation, or Parkinson's?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it can take a while to tease apart all of these issues, and so this is the kind of thing that needs a standardized assessment, because we as therapists would give some cognitive tests, and then compare the performance to others who are the same age but who don't have Parkinson's. And if you're doing the same as those, then we know that it's just aging. But if you're doing worse than that, then there's a question, okay, what's causing that? Is it problems with sleeping? So then we would have to say, okay, let's see if we can improve the sleep. And if then it might go away. And then if that's what it is, that's the sleep. So it's really like a little detective mystery in terms of working your way through all of the different factors. And the person's question really does show their knowledge of all these things that could be impacting cognition. And sometimes you just have to give it a try yourself and see, keep monitoring your issues and say, okay, I had a really good sleep last night, am I still having them today? And keep a little diary maybe, and that might help you also identify those factors.
Yeah, I think that diary idea is a really good idea too. Someone else has asked, is it common for cognitive deficits to worsen quite rapidly? And if so, should the neurologist be consulted to ascertain the reason for the rapid change?
Yeah, so we wouldn't expect it to be common. And I think if you have a rapid change in any of your symptoms, it would be a really good idea to go see your health professional, because that's suggesting there's something, might be something going on that could be, you could find an intervention for, so that you could potentially do something about it before it gets too worse. So yes, I would suggest that if it is getting worse quite quickly, and you haven't changed anything else, then definitely go talk to someone.
Great. Someone else says that they live alone and it's difficult for them to monitor themselves for
Yeah.
cognitive changes. And how would they best deal with that type of a situation?
Yeah, that's a good one. There, I don't want to recommend any assessments, but there is a website that's actually put out by the Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. And on their website, they have a little test that you can take. And it's a cognitive test that is a screening test. So, how you do on it doesn't really tell you anything in a snapshot, but it's the kind of thing that you could go and try again and again to see how you're doing on it. Now, remember that every time you take it, you'll have had some practice, so you'll do better the next time potentially. But it is a way to try to gauge, oh, how am I doing today? That really does point out to a gap that others have also noticed, and that is, how do we monitor these cognitive changes as a way to both identify, is there something that we could help with, and also as a way to figure out what's the course of the disease. And there are some computerized things that are happening, that are being developed, that potentially may be good later, coming up. But right now, I'm afraid this is all we have. The other thing you might want to do is, is find a buddy system with someone, and get some feedback from someone who knows you well, and see if there's any, if they have noticed anything too. And it doesn't hurt to go see your doctor once a year and get a checkup.
Right. And would you be able to send me a link later to that Baycrest website?
Yes, I can do
Okay,
that.
great. All right. All right. We're going to move on to another area where we had a lot of questions. Lots of people were asking about specific games and therapeutic
Yeah.
recommendations for maintaining and improving cognition. Someone said that they heard that games and puzzles are a good way to keep their brain active. And is that true?
Games and puzzles are a good way to stimulate your brain. They aren't really focused on any particular, just doing it on your own like that isn't going to be a therapy per se that we might, as a therapist, prescribe. But in the absence of any standard therapies right now, doing things that you enjoy, that keep your brain working, that make you have to learn new things is a really good approach. And it keeps you engaged, and it might be fun. And if you solve something, that's great feedback, and you feel, you might feel a little better having got through that, finished that crossword puzzle. And I think that, we know that cognitive engagement is important. So getting out, volunteering, learning a new, memorizing poems, doing anything that challenges you is really good. And but I also want to just give a shout out to physical activity, because I think the benefits can be just as strong.
Okay. And then someone had a follow-up question. What about digital games and sorry, and can those help to clear brain fog?
Yeah. So again, those computerized games, they can be amusing, and they can, give you some potential, keep you active. They might make you feel a little brighter. We don't really know what causes, ongoing brain fog. And probably, it's going to be a multiplicity of things, including the fatigue and the meds that you're taking. But if you enjoy those games, go ahead, but don't do them and not get out and not do other things as well. So it's all, it's sort of a way to balance. You need to keep thinking about that balance. And I talked about those 5 different factors. Well, don't do cognitive games and not, have some social time, or not do, physical time, or, things like that.
Right. Thank you. Um, someone asked if there's any games or activities that can actually prevent the onset of Parkinson's.
Not that we know of.
Mhm.
I'm afraid there isn't a positive answer for that one.
All right. So now we're going to move to a few questions about memory loss. Several registrants reported having issues with memory issues becoming more frequent. And what can they do to improve memory? And how quickly would it be normal to expect memory to decline?
Yeah, so memory is so multifactorial as well, because we need attention for memory. And as we get older, our memory does get a little less efficient. And in fact, our memory is actually designed to forget things, because otherwise we don't want to remember everything. And there's actually a really interesting book by the woman who couldn't forget anything, and she tells us about how awful it is to not to be able to forget things, and how it feels like she's always constantly getting a Google search in her head. So the design is to help things fade. And so to improve your memory, in fact, there's lots of books on the market about how to improve your memory, and they all say about the same thing. You need to pay attention, and have an active intention to remember something. You need to get to think about and process the material, because we don't remember things automatically as we get older. So you need to really think about them. And then there are some strategies for retrieving them as well. And it's a little too much to go into right now. I will say, and Donna, I can send you the info when we get going. We do run memory boot camps. And those are online sessions where we go into more of these strategies for improving memory. And if people are interested, I can send you the information. We probably won't do one, this is January. We probably won't do one until late spring. But that would be the earliest, but that is something that, you could get more from if you were interested in that.
Absolutely, that would be really appreciated. Someone has asked if blueberries can assist in slowing down memory loss.
Yeah, yeah. I don't really want to make dietary recommendations because I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian. There have been some suggestions that the Mediterranean diet is good for brain health. And to the extent that brain health is good for cognition, then maybe blueberries would be included in that diet. So in that sense, it might be a good thing, just in terms of following a good diet. I do know that there are specific diet issues with Parkinson's, and so I wouldn't recommend changing anything unless you're working with a dietitian or a nutritionist to know what to do.
Right. Thank you. Someone has asked, sometimes they can't remember if they actually experienced something or if they imagined it. And is that typical?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what happens as we get older. A lot of our memories turn into what's called gist memories, or you sort of have vague feelings about the general thing that happened, but not the specifics. And that's why they feel like they're more imaginary, because you can't recall all the details. So, probably in general, these vague memories could be real, but we also know that memories can change over time. As you retell a story, for instance, you might add little flourishes, or you might change little things, and we know this is really the case in research studies around memory. So there could be changes as you age and as you retell the stories in the actual events, in your memory for the events. And you may have even experienced this also when you compare notes with your sister and you say, do you remember when? And they have a totally different memory. So our memories are a little fallible, and it's easy to, it's easy to see how they might become a little less reliable, as the memories age.
Mhm. Great, thanks. Are there any therapies for someone who has extreme difficulty forming thoughts into words?
Yeah, so the word retrieval, I think I would go see a speech therapist, because we know that word retrieval can get harder, and they are specific therapies that speech therapists can do and help you with communication, that you could benefit potentially from.
Okay. So we've got some live questions that have just come in. Um, Someone has asked if it's recommended to leave the comfort zone once in a while, like changing work, learning a new music instrument, etc., to trigger challenge or our cognitive skills.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what I've been saying. And I
Mhm.
like the way you put that, getting out of your comfort zone. That's a nice way to characterize it. Yeah, that little challenge. And, we're also, especially coming out of the pandemic, I think we're all a little sedentary, and really developing new challenges for yourself, I think, is a great thing to do.
Mhm. So we've got two questions, and I'm going to blend them together. One person asked if having DBS can impact your cognition, and another person asked if you could explain briefly why there's a certain cutoff point in cognitive ability before someone can be considered for DBS. And I'm not sure if that is your area of specialty, but if you could just address those as best you can, that'd
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah, so I can't address, who's eligible for DBS because I don't work in that area. But I have seen that DBS can be associated with some changes in cognitive ability, and that's why they often do a cognitive assessment before they agree to do DBS. And if there are changes of concern, I think the thing to do is to talk to your doctor about that. And, again, if there are changes related to speech, then I would go for a speech therapy assessment.
Thank you. So I'm going to do one last question. We've been asked, what type of healthcare professional would you refer an individual with Parkinson's to if they're interested in working on cognition?
Yeah, well, the professions that tend to work with you around cognition are occupational therapists, and some, depending on where you are and availability, some psychologists also do rehabilitation. So those would be the two group that I would suggest to be the most could be the most available for that.
Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today, and I want to thank everyone who sent in questions. They were really great. If you have further questions or you want to talk more about Parkinson's and cognition after the webinar, you can contact Parkinson Canada's information and referral team at 1-888-664-1974 or support@parkinson.ca. And our website we'll have an information sheet there called Communicating with a Person Experiencing Cognitive Changes, and some care partners might find that helpful too. Today's webinar attendees are going to receive a follow-up email with a link to a recording of this webinar and links to any resources mentioned here today, along with that contact information for the information and referral team that I just mentioned. I'd like to take this time to invite you to join us at our next webinar, More Than Fun and Games, Leisure Activities in Parkinson's, taking place on Wednesday, February 21st from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. Watch your email inboxes in early February for the registration link. On behalf of all of us at Parkinson Canada, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.